Hello everyone, wishing you a wonderful day. Today we're going to dive into a gripping story of love, loyalty, and survival as we uncover whether Jack and Tu Tien can overcome the company's financial collapse after serious bridge construction violations left them unable to even pay the bank interest. Will love be enough to carry them through their darkest chapter? If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next videos. Life did not suddenly become perfect for Jack and Tu Tien after their baby boy was born. But for the first time in a very long while, it became peaceful. And after everything they had been through, peace felt almost miraculous. The house that had once been filled with silence, fear, and sleepless nights now carried a completely different kind of sound. There was the soft crying of a newborn in the middle of the night, the quiet laughter of two tired parents learning how to hold, feed, and comfort a tiny baby, and the gentle conversations that only happened when both of them were too exhausted to pretend to be strong anymore. This son changed everything. Jack, who had once stood in construction sites under scorching sunlight carrying the weight of contracts, steel, deadlines, and legal pressure, now found himself waking at the smallest sound from the crib. He learned how to hold the baby with the care of someone carrying the most precious thing in the world. He learned how to walk slowly through the room when the baby would not sleep. He learned how to calm down the second Tu Tien looked too tired, too pale, or too overwhelmed. And Tu Tien, despite all the pain, fear, and hardship she had endured during pregnancy, became the kind of mother who seemed to love with a whole being. Sometimes she would sit quietly and just look at their son for long stretches of time, as if she still could not believe he was really there. She would touch his tiny fingers, smooth his soft hair, and smile in that quiet way Jack had come to treasure more than anything else. There were moments when the two of them would look at each other over the baby's sleeping face and not say anything at all, because no words seemed big enough for what they were feeling. They had nearly lost too much. That was why even the smallest happy moments felt sacred. In the first few months after the baby's birth, Jack stayed as close to home as possible, not because he had lost ambition, and not because he was afraid to return to work, but because his priorities had changed in a way he could never undo. The investigation was over. His name had finally been cleared, and the truth about the bridge collapse had restored what the scandal had tried to take from him. But once he came home clean and free, and once he held his son in his arms for the first time, he understood something deeply. Work mattered, responsibility mattered, but family mattered more. That did not mean he abandoned the company. In fact, little by little, the company began to recover in a way no one had expected. At first, progress came slowly. After everything that had happened, many people had doubted whether Jack could rebuild anything at all. His company's name had been dragged through public suspicion. Old partners had stepped back. Workers had left. There had been debt, silence, embarrassment, and the kind of damage that usually takes years to repair. But once the truth came out clearly, the situation began to change. Some of the people who had once doubted him started looking at him differently. A few former partners reached out again, cautiously at first. Engineers and clients who had known his real character before the collapse began speaking on his behalf. They remembered that Jack was never a man who ignored standards, never someone who deliberately played with danger, never someone who built without conscience. That quiet trust, once broken, slowly began to return, and when it returned, opportunity followed. One on-track came first, not huge, but solid. Then another, then one that was large enough to make even Jack sit in silence for a moment after reading the final numbers. His company was not just surviving anymore, it was beginning to stand back up. With each valuable contract signed, the pressure that had once crushed him became lighter. The debts that had haunted him began to look more manageable. The bank calls became less aggressive. The office no longer felt like a place waiting for collapse. It became a place of movement again, of planning, of rebuilding. People started coming back. Not everyone, but enough. Some former workers returned because they believed in Jack. Some younger staff came because they had heard that even after everything, he had rebuilt from the ground up. And a few clients, seeing how he handled his second chance, began trusting him with larger projects. Tu Tien noticed the change before Jack ever said it out loud. At dinner, he no longer sat staring silently at his phone with a worried face. He still worked hard, but the desperation was gone. There were evenings when he would come home carrying the tiredness of a long day, but also a softness in his expression that had not been there before. One night, after putting the baby to sleep, Tu Tien looked at him and smiled. "You look different these days," she said. Jack, who was reviewing a file at the table, glanced up. "Different how?" "Lighter." He was quiet for a second, then looked down at the papers again. "Maybe I am," he admitted. Tu Tien walked over and sat beside him. "Is the company really doing better?" Jack nodded slowly. "Better than I expected." She studied his face, then the documents in front of him. "And are these the big contracts you were talking about?" Jack gave the faintest smile. "These are the ones that might finally change everything." That sentence stayed with her. Because for so long, everything had changed only in painful ways. Now, for the first time, it seemed life might be changing in their favor. As the company stabilized, life at home improved too. The house became more comfortable. Bills no longer felt like threats waiting on the table. Tu Tien did not have to count every small expense in silence the way she once had. Jack fixed things around the home he had put off during the worst period. He bought small things for the baby with an almost embarrassing amount of joy. Sometimes it was just a tiny outfit. Sometimes a blanket he insisted felt softer. Sometimes a toy their son was too young to even notice yet. Tu Tien would laugh and tell him he was becoming impossible. Jack would always answer the same way. "I missed enough already. Let me enjoy this." And he did enjoy it. He enjoyed carrying his son around the yard in the early evening. He enjoyed watching Tu Tien smile without sadness hiding behind it. He enjoyed eating meals that no longer felt rushed by fear. He enjoyed hearing ordinary sounds in the house and realizing ordinary life was no longer something to take for granted. Their son grew a little stronger, a little rounder, a little more expressive each week. Jack was completely captured by him. If the baby made the smallest sound, Jack would turn instantly. If the baby laughed, Jack would freeze like he had just heard the most important thing in the world. If Tu Tien left the room for even a moment, Jack would talk to the child as if they were holding serious conversations. Tu Tien once stood in the doorway and watched him doing exactly that. Jack was holding the baby against his shoulder, gently patting his back and speaking in a low voice. "You know," he said softly, "your mother thinks I spoil you too much already." The baby made a tiny sound. Jack nodded as if hearing an answer. "I know, I agree." Tu Tien laughed out loud, and Jack turned with absolutely no shame. "What?" he asked. "You're ridiculous, and he loves me for it." That kind of happiness became part of their die. Live life, simple happiness, earned happiness. The kind built not from luck, but from surviving enough sorrow to finally recognize peace when it comes. But even peaceful lives are never fully free from uncertainty. As things improved, new responsibilities came with them. Jack's company was signing bigger contracts now, and bigger contracts meant more pressure, more meetings, more expectations, and more people depending on him again. He tried to balance everything carefully. He promised himself that he would never let work take him so far away from his family that he forgot what he almost lost. But sometimes, even with the best intentions, life starts moving faster than people expect. There were days when he had to leave early and return late. Days when the office called more often. Days when his attention had to split between home and work in ways that made him uneasy, even if the reason was good. Tu Tien noticed that too. One evening, after Jack returned home later than expected, she was already sitting with the baby asleep in her arms. She looked tired, though not unhappy, and Jack saw it immediately. "I'm late," he said softly. Tu Tien smiled, but it was the kind of smile that carried a little more understanding than joy. "You've been late 3 times this week." Jack moved closer and lowered his voice. "I know." She glanced down at the baby, then back at him. "The company really is growing again, isn't it?" Jack nodded. "Yes." Tu Tien looked at him carefully. She was proud of him. That much was obvious. But in her eyes, there was also something else. Not fear exactly, just the quiet awareness of someone who remembered how easily life could shift. Jack sat beside her and touched the baby's tiny hand. "I won't let work take me away from this," he said. Tu Tien held his gaze. "I know you won't try to. I'm just wondering whether life will let us stay this happy for long." That question stayed in the air between them, because after everything, both of them knew better than most people that peace could be fragile. And somewhere beneath the warmth of their new life, the same quiet question began to rise again. Now that happiness had finally returned to Jack and Tu Tien, would life leave them alone at last, or was another unexpected storm already waiting just beyond the calm? That question did not leave Tu Tien's mind after she spoke it. Now that life was finally calmer, now that Jack had been cleared, their son was healthy, and the company was starting to rise again, a part of her wanted to relax completely and enjoy it. But another part of her, the part shaped by too many painful turns, knew how quickly happiness could be shaken. Not because she wanted to be negative, not because she did not trust the future, but because she had already seen how fast one phone call, one hidden betrayal, or one unexpected piece of news could turn peace into fear. Jack understood that look in her eyes better than anyone. That night, after putting the baby to sleep, he found Tu Tien still sitting quietly by the window. She was not crying, not upset, not even especially troubled on the surface, but he knew her well enough to recognize when her thoughts had gone somewhere deep. He walked over and sat beside her. "You're thinking again," he said softly. Tu Tien gave a faint smile. "You always know." Jack reached for her hand. "Then tell me." She looked down at their finger for a moment before answering. "I'm happy, Jack. Really happy. Sometimes so happy it scares me." Jack listened without interrupting. "I keep thinking maybe I should just enjoy it and stop worrying," she continued. "But then I remember everything that happened before, and I wonder if life is only being quiet because it's preparing something else." Jack was silent for a few seconds. Then he turned toward her and spoke in the calm, steady voice she trusted most. "Maybe life will still test us," he said. "Maybe it won't. But if something comes, it won't find us the same way it did before." Tu Tien looked at him. Jack gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "Before, I was carrying too much alone. You were carrying too much alone. We were trying to survive from opposite sides of the same storm. Now we know better." That reached her more deeply than he knew. Because he was right. The old version of their life had been built on strain, silence, and sacrifice. The life they had now, even if still fragile, was built on something else. They had already seen each other at their weakest. They had already survived scandal, prison, fear, pregnancy under pressure, and the terror of nearly losing their child. Whatever came next would not meet strangers. It would meet a family that had already learned how to hold on. And for a while that was enough. The following weeks moved with a gentler rhythm. Jack kept his promise about balance. He still worked hard, and the company continued to grow, but he became stricter with his time. If a meeting could wait until morning, it waited. If something could be handled by someone else, he delegated it. If he promised Tu Tien he would be home for dinner, he treated that promise as seriously as any contract. The people around him noticed the change too. At the office, Jack was still firm, still focused, still respected. But there was a different kind of calm in him now. He was no longer chasing survival with the desperation of a man who had his back against the wall. He was rebuilding with purpose, and that made him stronger. New contracts kept coming in. Some were medium-sized, some were large, and a few were valuable enough to shift the company's future in a lasting way. The numbers on paper no longer looked like a fight to stay alive. They started looking like recovery, then slowly like growth. One afternoon, Jack came home carrying a folder and a look on his face that immediately caught Tu Tien's attention. "What happened?" she asked, bouncing the baby gently in her arms. Jack stood in front of her for a second, almost like he wanted to hold the moment before speaking. "We signed it," he said. Tu Tien blinked. "The contract?" Jack nodded, and this time he could not hide the smile. The biggest one since everything happened. For a second, Tu Tien just stared at him. Then she laughed softly, half in disbelief and half in joy. Jack. He crossed the room and leaned down to kiss the baby's head first, then hers. "We're really getting through it," he said quietly. That evening, their happiness was not loud, but it was deep. Tu Tien cooked a simple meal, Jack held the baby longer than usual, and the three of them sat together in a peace that felt earned. Not perfect, not dramatic, just real. But life, even in peaceful times, has its own way of reminding people not to hold too tightly to certainty. The first sign was small. Jack had been coming home later a little more often, not every day, and not enough to break his promise, but enough for Tu Tien to notice. Sometimes a site call ran longer. Sometimes a client delayed a decision. Sometimes a supplier issue had to be handled immediately. None of it was dangerous in itself. Still, Tu Tien noticed. And because she noticed, she also noticed something else. Jack was growing tired again. Not in the old way, not in the broken, desperate way he had once looked, but in the quiet way of a man trying to do everything right, be a good father, be present for his wife, rebuild his company, and make up for all the time life has stolen from them. One night, after the baby finally fell asleep, Tu Tien looked at him across the table and asked, "Are you overworking yourself again?" Jack looked up from the documents in front of him and smiled faintly. That sounded too fast. "Were you waiting to say that?" "I was watching you think you were hiding it." Jack leaned back in his chair. "I'm fine." Tu Tien raised an eyebrow immediately. He laughed under his breath. "All right, maybe I'm a little tired." "A little?" Jack looked down at the papers, then back at her. "The company is growing faster than I expected. That's a good problem. But it's still a problem I have to manage." Tu Tien's expression softened. "I know. I'm not asking you to stop working. I'm asking you not to disappear into it again." That sentence landed more heavily than she intended, and both of them knew why. Because work had once been tied to loss, fear, and distance. Not because ambition was wrong, but because they had already lived through what happened when life became nothing but responsibility and pressure. Jack stood up, walked over to her, and crouched beside her chair. "I won't disappear," he said quietly. Tu Tien looked at him carefully. "Promise." He nodded. "Promise." He nodded. "Promise." Then he rested his forehead briefly against her hand, a gesture so small and intimate that it said more than long speeches ever could. For a while, it truly seemed that life was listening. The baby grew stronger and more expressive every day. He began reacting to their voices more clearly, making tiny sounds that felt like the beginning of language, and smiling in ways that made both Jack and Tu Tien stop whatever they were doing just to stare at him in wonder. Jack was completely lost to fatherhood now. If the baby laughed, Jack looked proud, as if he had personally achieved something impressive. If the baby frowned, Jack tried to negotiate with him like they were discussing a serious business matter. If the child woke in the middle of the night, Jack often got there before Tu Tien, insisting she stay resting while he handled it. One morning, Tu Tien woke to find Jack pacing slowly through the room with the baby in his arms, speaking softly as though giving him life advice. "You have 2 jobs," Jack was saying. "Grow well and don't scare your mother, understand?" The baby blinked at him. Jack nodded solemnly. "Good, we agree." Tu Tien laughed from the bed, and Jack turned without even pretending to be embarrassed. "What?" he asked. "You talk to him like he's already 10 years old. He understands more than you think." That kind of warmth filled their days, but underneath it, life was still moving. The company's growth brought bigger opportunities, and bigger opportunities brought bigger expectations. More clients wanted Jack's attention. More projects were lining up. More people were beginning to depend on him again, and with that came one quiet possibility. Neither of them wanted to name too quickly. If things kept improving, Jack might have to spend more time away from home than either of them wanted. The thought first became real when he came home one evening carrying a folder and wearing an expression Tu Tien had learned to read carefully. He sat down, placed the folder on the table, and stayed silent for a second too long. Tu Tien looked at him, then at the folder, then back at him. "What is it?" Jack exhaled slowly. "A new project, Pope." "It doesn't sound bad." "It isn't." He paused. "But it's large, very large." Tu Tien waited. Jack finally continued. "Large enough that if we take it, it could move the company to another level." Tu Tien glanced at the baby sleeping nearby, then back to Jack's face. "And what's the catch?" Jack looked at her for a long moment. "It would require me to travel more, at least for a while." The room went quiet, not because either of them wanted to dramatize it, not because travel itself was a disaster, but because they both knew that sometimes the next storm does not arrive as scandal or tragedy. Sometimes it arrives as distance. And as that realization settled quietly between them, only one question remained. Now that Jack and Tu Tien had finally found peace, would success begin pulling them apart in a way pain never could?